Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this is the Talamanca Review. It's Wednesday, the 19th of June, and it's 11:26 p.m. in my part of the world, which is southern Costa Rica, Talamanca Mountains to be specific. And tonight we're going to get back into a little bit of Stardust Ranch and a lot more about John Edmonds before I get into the story proper. I've been giving this a lot of thought, and it requires a lot of thought because I'm dealing with a man's legacy, and he is one of the more extraordinary human beings I've met in my life. Definitely in the top five. A unique human being, a complete and total maverick, somebody who requires attentive detail to his biography, and I hope to do that. I hope to do John justice. So let me just go back into his background a little bit, So John was born in Evanston, Illinois. He was half Cherokee and half Irish. Now, something that did not come out in the book is that John was put into the Superman programs. I call them the Superman programs. I think that their original term from the Nazis was the Übermensch. And this is, of course, the trauma-based conditioning to produce a superior human being, male or female, and specifically psychically superior, in some instances physically superior, but psychic superiority will usually mean physical superiority as well, because a lot of our strength is drawn from the other side. This is one of the great secrets of the martial arts. It's a sport now, but in its original form 100, 200 years ago, you would be dealing with people who could leave their bodies. I'm sure a lot of the masters in these traditions can still do these things, but it has flatlined a little bit. There's a power of consciousness, the power of imagination. So John came from a very connected family. I don't know if his father, I suspect, I don't want to misremember this because it is a rather important detail. But if I remember correctly, his father was in the CIA and had the option to put his child into one of these programs. So when we think of these programs, we usually think of victims. This is certainly the case when we look at the beginning of the MK Ultra program, which, as our stated history tells us, started in McGill University Hospital in Montreal with a Scottish doctor by the name of Dr. Ewan McGregor, I believe his name was. Yes, that's correct, Ewan McGregor. And this was in the 50s and 60s. And they were experimenting with sound, sleep deprivation, drugs, and various forms of sensory deprivation, like keeping you blindfolded for days on end. And they were seeking to crack open the human being to find the Übermensch, the Superman, the MK Ultra soldier, the Jason Bourne, the secretary with a photographic memory that you could put into an office somewhere as a spy. All of these things were dividends of what I call the Übermensch program. Now, this has certain overlays with the satanic culture, because the satanic culture is one in which the individual will is worshipped more than a divine source of life, which is one of the true teachings of Satanism, which, if I'm being honest, has been greatly maligned, and that's largely due to ignorance. There can certainly be seen what I would call a positive satanic expression. That may sound like an oxymoron, a contradiction, a paradox, but I assure you it is not. And so John was put into this program as a young child. He saw some of the things that you see in these programs. I will not repeat them, but they are very, very traumatic. If you have ever seen a 1998 movie called Soldier with Kurt Russell, very unusual role for Kurt Russell, it is a sort of soft disclosure for the Ubermensch program. In that time, in the not too distant future, soldiers are raised from birth. They're born, the babies are put into the program. Some make it, some don't. The ones that don't are killed, and they create a perfect elite corps of soldiers. And Kurt Russell plays one of these soldiers named Todd. And it's worth watching. I highly recommend you watch the movie. Definitely worth watching. So John saw some very horrible things, and he left the program at the age of 14, according to his own narrative, as a result of a severe head injury, which happened when he went over the guardrail of an overpass bridge on a bicycle and fell onto his head some 30 feet below. Not on the highway that the overpass went over, but at the side. And he spent a considerable amount of time in the hospital. If I remember correctly, the time was denoted in months, not weeks. I think he lost a year of school as well. We spoke about that, actually. He was a different person. And I sort of smelled this on him as we were doing the early interviews in 2012. And I could sense that he had this super soldier consciousness about him. So when you're in the consciousness game, and I'm definitely in the consciousness game, lifelong meditator, lifelong student of the spiritual arts and practices, and significant experiencer, not what I would call an enlightened person. I'm not even sure I know what that means. I'm not sure the Indians even know what it means anymore, or the Buddhists even know what it means anymore. So I don't, it's just a word, enlightened. I can tell you that my worldview incorporates the body, and outside of the body, my interpretation of events is always multidimensional and multi-party, where sometimes the parties can just be other human agencies that stay invisible and pretend they did not affect the outcome of a situation, but they do. And then there are other agencies which are invisible, which can be invoked to alter or favor the outcome of a circumstance or situation. And this, of course, is the magic that we spoke about so much when I went over all of this in The Devil in Us, a memoir of you and me. So it's interesting to note that John began his life in the Ubermensch programs. When he was in the hospital when he was 14, he had many out-of-body experiences. He remembers engaging with beings exactly like you hear in the near-death experience stories. And John remained, right up until the day he passed, a relatively connected human being. His family was spread out in various industries, but mainly law, and most of his cousins and brothers and sisters who were not put into the Ubermensch programs went to Harvard, and they were Harvard Law School graduates. And so John was a little bit of a black sheep in the family. He had a grandfather that he would spend time with outside of Evanston, more in the woods, what I would call a cabin dweller. And this was his native grandfather, because John, as I said, was half Cherokee Indian. Very interesting racial mix. Now, for favorable outcome in the programs at the stage of development they were at in the 60s, which is when John would have been in them because he was born in the late 50s and 58 or 59, so he would have been expelled from the program with the head injury in about 72 or 73. But when he was going through these programs in the 60s, there was widespread consensus that the most successful candidates were Celtic and Native. Celtic being Irish or Scottish, and Native being generally North American Native. Not Central American, but specifically North American Native. And so John had both of these ethnicities. I can tell you he was a very powerful psychic, very powerful psychic. And after that, he was very athletic in high school, and he went on to college. I forget what he originally studied out of high school, but it didn't serve him well. He went back to school later on in his 30s, I believe, and got a degree in social work and counseling and psychiatric counseling, a master's degree, I believe. Now, John had a very colorful life in his 20s. He ran an event company that did large concerts, organizing and promoting them in the Chicago area. So John Edmonds in his 20s partied with the likes of everybody in the 80s. I mean everybody. You name it. David Bowie, Led Zeppelin. He was good friends with Jimmy Page. And for those of you who don't know, and John Edmonds told me this, Jimmy Page is about one of the most accomplished wizards that John Edmonds had ever encountered. And that included in the government programs he had an ancillary association with. Jimmy Page, the guitarist for Led Zeppelin, was a very, very accomplished occultist, could astral travel with ease, go beyond the astral plane, and a lot of the music that came out of Led Zeppelin was profoundly influenced by these magical tendencies. And you can hear it if you listen to it. So he knew Jimmy Page, and I think stayed in touch with Jimmy Page for a number of years, maybe most of his life. This was another odd thing about John Edmonds. He had all kinds of very interesting friends. And I wouldn't call him a name dropper. It was getting a name out of him was like pulling teeth, okay? And I'm not going to repeat any names, but there were a lot of people who went out to the ranch to spend weekends there, under John's protection, of course. I don't think that these people would go there on their own. Now remember, this ranch was not that far from Los Angeles. Arizona is not that far from Los Angeles. You could drive out on a Saturday morning, spend Saturday night there, and drive back Sunday afternoon or Monday afternoon and spend a couple days with John at the ranch, having a barbecue, maybe having an alien encounter. John told me that the ranch affected different people differently. Some people could go there and have an absolutely horrific experience, and other people could go there and have an artistic breakthrough, get through a block they had been grappling with for quite some time on an artistic project and finish the project, or receive the inspiration to finish the project. Had a different effect on everybody who went out there. But a lot of Hollywood people went out there. A lot of big business people went out there. A lot of famous people went out there. You know, people in show business, people in music. John was incredibly connected. He was also on very good terms with the Hells Angels in Arizona. He was not himself a biker per se, but he was on fairly good terms with the Hells Angels. So just really about one of the most colorful characters you could ever meet in your life. and a bona fide American original. They just don't make them like this anymore, John Edmonds. So these are a few of the facts of John's early life and some of the things that I wanted to share with you. I will also tell you that he was very influenced by his Cherokee grandfather and really cherished the time he spent in the woods with that man outside of Evanston, Illinois, and in the rural areas there. Now, this is a wonderful opportunity to talk again about the correlation between psychic ability or open consciousness and UFO experience. Very often, the people who have UFO experiences are psychically or spiritually lit up in some way. And this forces us and me to pose a very interesting question at this point. Did John find the ranch in 1997, or did the ranch find John? Or was John assigned to the ranch as a kind of custodian and a kind of guardian because the U.S. intelligence and military establishment knew already that there were portals there? I suspect that's not true, and I'll explain why in further episodes of this series, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. I think that John legitimately stumbled upon this ranch. But given what I've told you about John now, don't you find it like a divine coincidence that this guy would end up being the steward of Stardust Ranch? I mean, you could not want somebody better there. And now you know a little bit more about the kind of human being that could take an alien Grey's head off with a samurai sword. And I don't want you to feel sorry for these Greys. They're kind of organic robots. They're not really human, or they're not souled. Okay? Anything that is unsouled is not really in the life matrix. They can seem like they're in the life matrix because they move, they seem to have autonomy and things like this, but they're not. So there's nothing really to get too worked up about there. What I can tell you as well is that John was, after he settled down and, after the music business and all of this, he went out to Arizona and originally lived in Phoenix. And he had a profession there, or a job. I can't remember if it was a counseling profession where he saw clients or he worked. Yeah, he had his own profession where he saw people and he counseled. And he did this for a number of years, and then he got it into his head that he wanted to live on a ranch. And he was still single at this time. He found his wife, Joyce, in these years in Phoenix, and she was originally from Wisconsin. And he decided that he wanted to live on a ranch. And so they began looking at ranches. And as they went around Arizona and Phoenix, they found that most of the ranches were beyond their purchasing ability. They were too expensive. And this took him out to the Buckeye area, which was in 97 a relatively undeveloped area in Arizona. And prices were quite a bit cheaper. And this led him to the ranch that came to be named Stardust Ranch. And the ranch itself had something of a colorful history. It had been on the market for some time, and there weren't a lot of buyers. John and Joyce were not told why by the real estate agents, the realtors, but it was within their budget. It had the kind of acreage John was looking for. It was not a big ranch. It was only about 10 acres. And it had a big 5-bedroom house. It should have been a lot more than they were asking at the time, but it wasn't. And so they decided to buy it. And this begins the story of Stardust Ranch and John moving in there. Now, understanding John before he went to the ranch is really critical to understanding John on the ranch. Okay? So, let me tell you, because I like to pepper these stories with my own anecdotal information, my own stories that corroborate what I'm telling you. So, in 2002, I secured my first literary agent based on 2 manuscripts. And I was asked to do a rewrite by my agency under certain guidelines of the manuscripts. And so I undertook to rewrite the favorite of my manuscripts. And this was done over the course of about 3 months in 2002. And I rented a cabin in northern Ontario, about 3 hours north of Toronto. It sat on a lake. It had no electricity. And I had to work on a laptop computer. And that laptop computer was powered by an extension cord that came from the main cottage on the lake. And it was about 100 meters. So it was just the sound of the lake water, the waves of the lake that would put me to sleep every night. It was a very beautiful and peaceful place to be. And I set to work on this manuscript. And because I had limited time and I'd always wanted to be a writer, I took this very, very seriously. While I was writing, I was fasting. And I only ate 1 meal a day, and it was the same meal every day for 3 months. It was 2 eggs, 2 pieces of dry brown toast, and 2 tomato slices. And the rest of the time I was drinking a beverage, which was maple syrup, lemon, and cayenne pepper, which is a fasting beverage. I had no distractions in the cabin. I had brought 4 or 5 books with me, big books that I could read when I had writer's block. But I wanted to force myself to write, and so that's what I did. There wasn't even a refrigerator or a coffee maker in the cabin. If I wanted a coffee, I had to go and make it in the main house. So I spent a lot of time meditating, a lot of time doing Qigong, and a lot of time writing, and a lot of time just contemplating, just sitting on the sofa and thinking about what I wanted to do next with the book. And these have always been my most favorite periods in life, when I'm working on something, when I'm writing something. They're just so magical. I don't know quite how to explain the gravity that writing has on my life. But the solitude of this 12 weeks up in the middle of nowhere, working on this manuscript and meditating so much, and the fasting, completely lit me up. I was just walking an inch off the ground. Everybody who encountered me could feel the energy coming off of me. It was like I was radioactive, like I was glowing. When I got back home and I settled into my home, I had a friend staying with me, and it was a 4-bedroom home, and this was just about a year after the divorce, and I was living very close to my son, about a block away, and he had come over to see me as soon as I got back from the writing, although I had come back once or twice for a weekend and seen him, and he knew what I was doing, so he was okay with it. And I was just a different person back then. I had a tremendous amount of energy going through me. And my friend and I, the second night I was back home after these 12 weeks, were leaving the front door of this family dwelling that I was renting. It was a 4-bedroom house. and a completely separate house, meaning it wasn't a townhouse, it wasn't connected to other houses. And when we came out the front door, we both saw these two lights just take off in the sky, like almost faster than you could see. And I looked at my friend, and he was about a decade older than me, and he was a stand-up comedian. And I said, "Did you see that?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "What was that?" He said, "I don't know." And I said, "Do you think it was spotlights? That there's a sale going on somewhere at a mall or something and they have those super powerful spotlights?" He said, "No, it wasn't a spotlight," and he gave the reasons why, and he was right. And I said, "Well, we're not that far from the airport, Pearson Airport in the West End of Toronto. Was there something going to the airport?" He goes, "No." And we thought about this and talked about this, got into my car, drove, and came to the conclusion that this was a UFO. And it was. It was really a remarkable experience, one of several, about a half dozen experiences I've had now in my life with UFOs. And I tell the story because it happened when I was completely lit up psychically and spiritually. After 12 weeks of living in a remote area, no electronics around me, meditating every day, working creatively on a novel manuscript rewrite, and just plowing through this work, and I had just ramped up and ramped up and ramped up my energy. And the extraterrestrials came in to take a look at me. And this happens, and this is why so many people that are psychically lit up or spiritually lit up will talk about UFOs. Sadhguru, the Vedic yogic master, has done a few videos on UFOs. There's the Sri M clip I played for you, where he was in the cave with his guru, and a UFO came and a reptilian got out and wanted counsel with his guru because there was something he needed advice on that was going on his home planet. But in spiritual communities, this contact with UFOs is well known. And so you may ask yourself, why is it spilling out into the mainstream now? Is it because the general human consciousness is rising? It's a probable hypothesis. And as the consciousness, the general consciousness of human beings rises, what happens in tandem with this is a lot of the stuff operating at a slightly different vibrational frequency becomes manifest. Not all the time, but the matrix begins to glitch, so to speak. It's not that the matrix is glitching, it's that our consciousness can apprehend more now. And so more and more and more people are having these UFO experiences. They've always been here. They've always been visiting Earth since the beginning of time. Okay? Always. Different races from different places. And this idea that this is a new phenomenon is completely ridiculous. Or the idea that it is just another expression of otherworldly or non-human life, which has also been a perennial aspect of the human experience when you think about the Irish with their fairies and pixies. But no, it is different. It is UFOs, unidentified flying objects. And very often people who meditate will talk about having 1, 2, 3, or a half dozen UFO experiences in their life. Okay? So John was lit up. He was in this Ubermensch program for about a decade, and he had been psychically cracked open. So Stardust Ranch was not his first encounter with UFOs. He'd had encounters with extraterrestrials before Stardust Ranch. This is another thing that didn't come out in the book. And there were reasons we told the story the way we did. We wanted it to flow a certain way. We wanted to... And the story is about the ranch, which is a phenomenal place with a phenomenal phenomenon going on it, which is the portals. So this is something to consider and something to think about. But John, as an individual, had been intermittently attracting UFO attention from 6 or 7 years old, okay? As many people who have consciousness will. And we who know about these things don't make a big deal about them. There's reasons they're being talked about much more now, and we'll get into those reasons as we get into Stardust Ranch and discuss the story more. But I don't want to be preemptive. All right, so I think that's enough of an introduction to John Edmonds, and I think that it's important now that we move into the story proper, which I will do tomorrow. I am Bruce McDonald, and this has been the Talamanca Review.
If you are anything like me, you are blown away by the recent testimony to the House Subcommittee on National Security about the UAP experience of Major David Grush. Here's a guy that was a career Air Force officer that was later on moved into the intelligence community to explore and to research UAP and UFO activity. And while he was in that role, he was informed of a multi-decade UFO project, a program that was supposed to retrieve and reverse engineer possible extraterrestrial technology. Now, I'm one of those people who has always been skeptical about these types of reports, about this idea that there's alien technology that crashed here in the 50s, and then somehow it was hidden from the American public, and now here we are 70 some years later wondering if it's really true. Now here's where the rubber kind of meets the road. We have seen more technological advances in American society in the last 40 years than we've seen in the entire history of the human race. Now we've been saying for a long time that that's evidence of the human experience. As we've mastered the sciences, we've been able to unlock and expedite the way that we learn new technology. But with reports like David Grush's, plus the reports that we've seen released to the American public over the last 10 years specifically, we have to start asking ourselves the harder question. How much of our technology really is ours from our own development, and how much of it may have been informed from reverse engineering projects exactly like the one that Major Grush is referencing in his conversation with Congress? Think about it. Solid state memory. Semiconductors never existed, and then all of a sudden, they're everywhere. We had the rise of hypersonic missiles, hypersonic flights. Nobody had ever heard of it, and then all of a sudden, everybody's talking about it. Hypersonic missiles, hypersonic jets, hypersonic combustion engines. Now, everybody's talking about artificial intelligence. When I was a kid, artificial intelligence seemed like it was never going to be a reality, and yet somehow here we are so afraid of it advancing quickly that we're actually starting to put policy in place to slow it down. So are we really living in an age where human beings are developing technology at such a breakneck pace that we are just on the cutting edge of science? Or has there been a foundation of some kind of reverse engineering project or program active here in the United States? Now, if that's not enough to kind of set your head spinning and asking yourself some hard questions, I have to then also say, if that kind of program has existed here in the United States, if we have successfully retrieved, recovered, and reverse engineered some sort of extraterrestrial, alien, non-human technology like what Major Grush is talking about, then that would mean there's a really good probability that our adversaries have done the same thing. In fact, the whole reason the UAP task force and the House and Congress have all gotten together to support and encourage this deeper dive into UAP and UFO activity is because there is national security implication if the 2004 videos that came from the Navy, if the reports that we've been collecting since the 1950s, if the confidential intelligence reports recently released by CIA and NSA, if those reports relate to advanced weaponry and developments by our adversaries that give them a technological or military superiority over the United States, all of a sudden we have to take a look at this information through a very critical lens. Because if we have successfully retrieved and reverse engineered technology for ourselves, then we have to assume the same thing is true about our adversaries. That alien spacecraft or non-human technology that might have crash landed here in the US has also crash landed within the borders of our adversarial countries, Russia, China, Iran. These are all countries that would be able to take advanced technology, reverse engineer it, and create something of their own. That is how the Chinese developed cellular technology, by stealing it from the United States, reverse engineering it, and creating their own. That's how the Iranians and the Russians started advancing their nuclear programs, by stealing from the United States, reverse engineering it, and creating their own. How is it that the Russians and the Chinese developed hypersonic missiles faster than the United States? More importantly, where did the technology for hypersonic missiles even come from? If the countries that are known for reverse engineering American technology created it first, does that mean that they stole it from us, or they reverse engineered it from somewhere else? These are the questions we have to ask. Now, we also have to consider the source of information here, because there's a lot of conversation and not a lot of clear fact. For example, where exactly and what exactly was retired or former Air Force officer Major Grush's background? According to some news reports, he spent 14 years with the Air Force before he left. You can't retire after 14 years of service. But then there are other news reports that are saying he's a retired Air Force officer. Some reports are saying that he worked for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, or NGA. Others are saying he worked for the National Reconnaissance Organization, or NRO. So what we're seeing here is a preponderance of news, but not necessarily a preponderance of clear facts. We don't know what Major Grush's background is. We don't know what he was or wasn't involved in. We don't know what his role in the intelligence community was. We don't know if he was a successful officer, if he was a problem child. We don't know anything about him as a source. When CIA considers a source of information, the first thing they do is they review the credibility of the source itself. When CIA considers the factual impact of a piece of information, the first thing we do is vet the source. And in this case, there's not enough information about the source, or Major Grush, to be able to confirm or deny that the information he's sharing is really truthful, factual, and complete. What we do know is that he has come out and said, under oath in front of the American legislative body of the country, that he was part of or informed of a multi-decade effort to retrieve and reverse engineer alien technology, UFO, UAP technology. Never before has this question been so impactful, so relevant, and so significant to the American public, because our government is taking UAP and UFO sightings more seriously than they ever have. We have an existing government-funded UAP task force that actually has congressional oversight, specifically because they're considering the impact of UAPs on national security priorities. We also have multiple uniformed officers, multiple former government officers from CIA to DIA, so we have to take it seriously when we see these senior ranking officers come out and put themselves in the public spotlight and put their entire career, their entire reputation on the line in order to say something that they believe is important and impactful and relevant to the entirety of potentially the human race and at least the national security infrastructure. As I continue to follow this story, I'm going to be paying attention to who is Major Grush? What programs was he part of? Was he part of NRO? Was he part of NGA? Because depending on which federal agency he belonged to, NRO is highly focused on space and satellite operations, while NGA is more focused on imagery analysis and imagery intelligence. Two very separate types of agencies, one of which would absolutely have a role in the retrieval and reverse engineering of alien technology. If you're as curious as I am about what's going to happen next, stay tuned, hit subscribe, and follow along, because I'm going to continue picking this case apart as we keep getting new updates. I've been following the UFO and UAP issue for a long time, and in 2001 I was actually commissioned to do my own independent research into the UFO UAP phenomenon here in the United States. If you want access to my findings, go ahead and click here and you'll be able to download your own free report at no cost to you.